Okay, we've had a bit of rain, eh?
Yeah.
We saw driving along the road, there's lots of water in the gutters. So what we're going to look at tonight is diabetes. And diabetes, in Australia, there are 500 new diabetics being diagnosed every day in Australia. And if we want to talk about pandemics, there's another one, isn't it? And there was no diabetes on the planet till sugar was well established. There's no mention of diabetes in Hippocrates' writings. And even medicine acknowledges that diabetes is a lifestyle disease. And we have seen many people, type 1 and type 2, totally conquer diabetes. And what does medicine say about type 1 diabetes? There is no cure. What we do is we give the body the right conditions. And there are certain things that wear out pancreases. And by the way, I'm against child abuse, I'm against animal abuse, and I'm against pancreatic abuse. And the crazy thing is that many people are abusing their pancreases without even knowing it. That's like someone kicking a dog and not realising it's hurting the dog. It's crazy. But that's the great deception of it. And on the first meeting, we looked at the two systems. They're almost on opposite ends of the equation. One is the body can heal itself, and it'll heal if you give it the right conditions, and it needs faith. Faith in a God that created our body, that to heal, and that also takes a little bit of time. But you've also got to find out why the body's not working well. And then the other system is a system that's really based on fear. And never should we make a decision based on fear. And in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, God says, I've not given you the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And a sound mind considers these things. A sound mind weighs up the pros and cons. That's why it's a very good thing to say to the health professional that says, you've got to do this straight away. You say, thank you so much for your advice. I'm going to seriously consider it. I'm going to use my sound mind to assess these things and then make an informed choice. And that's why my husband called his political party in Australia the Informed Medical Options Party, because I am the master of my destiny. Isn't that right? I'm the one that chooses what I do and what I do not do to my body. But of course the crazy thing is, with deception, what is deception? It's not as it appears. That's the deception, isn't it? It appears, okay, it appears like it's not going to hurt you. And when I'm reading the history of medicine, that George Washington, he was bled about 10 times. They thought that bleeding would heal a person. And some of the drugs way back then in the late 1700s, early mid-1800s, they're pretty toxic. A lot of them were based on mercury and, crazy things. And that's when a lot of people went to natural remedies. I was reading of a health retreat in New York by Dr. Jackson. He had 4 doctors on his team, and he says in 20 years he's never used a drug. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a retreat like that or a hospital like that? And then some say, oh, but the drugs back then were toxic. Are they less toxic today? I'd like to suggest not, because that's the deception. It's like one cigarette doesn't give you lung cancer, does it? But after day after day, after year, and the same with the drugs. They might be used in a crisis to save a life, but the continual use has an effect. So what is the cause? What is the cause of diabetes? We're going to go to the CBD, Central Business District of the human body, the inside workings of the cell. And we're going to have a look at how the cell works. We've looked at it a few times this week. I'm sure you're getting familiar with this. And I'm sure when I first wrote it, you thought, what's she doing? But you're starting to get to know it. And I'm really just drawing you. I'm really just talking about you here. So the glucose goes in, and it goes in under the action of insulin. Insulin's the key that unlocks the door to let the glucose into the cell. And that glucose, under the action of insulin, goes through a 20-step pathway which delivers 2 units of energy. The end result is the chemical form of glucose called pyruvate, and pyruvate, as the chemical form of glucose, gets fed into the next section. It's the 8-step pathway that's commonly called the powerhouse of the cell, because this 8-step pathway delivers to us a very impressive 36 units of energy. The difference is oxygen. So this is what's commonly called the aerobic pathway, because it's the pathway that uses oxygen. This is called the anaerobic pathway, because the anaerobic pathway produces energy by the process of fermentation. It does not use oxygen. We also looked at how the body stores glucose, excess glucose, as glycogen, a quick-release glucose stores. We looked at the carbohydrate list, and I want to look at it again in relationship to diabetes, because our blood glucose levels are mostly influenced, I say mostly, not all, but mostly influenced by the food that we are eating. Cereal, a very common morning meal. Bread, another common morning meal. And cakes, etc. In Australia, you call them cookies, we call them biscuits. So when Australians come to America and they see a sign that says biscuits and gravy, we think these Americans, they eat really strange. Because in our mind it'd be like your cookies and gravy. But I do understand your biscuit is like a scone, is that right? Or a roll, a bread roll? Yeah, yeah. Pizza and pasta. We're looking at a very typical diet with lots of Americans and Australians, rice, potatoes, and the least carbohydrate is the sugar. When I say least, I'm talking about nutritive value. This all breaks down in the body to glucose, and the glucose gets sent to the cell. And to get into the cell, it needs insulin. So here's the pancreas. And the pancreas produces 2 hormones that balance blood glucose levels. So one hormone is insulin. And insulin's the hormone that's designed to get blood sugar levels down. The other hormone is glucagon. And glucagon is the hormone that's designed to get the blood sugar levels up again. So the pancreas is the main organ that is balancing blood glucose levels. So when glucose goes in under the action of insulin, and that's how the pancreas balances blood glucose levels. When the blood sugar level goes up, the insulin's released to get the glucose out of the blood and into the cell. That's how it balances it. So the first place the glucose is sent is to the cell. And if there is glucose left over, it gets stored as glycogen. Glycogen is a name given to these quick-release glucose stores. That's why you don't have to eat before you exercise, because you've got all these glycogen stores. And as you exercise, they're plucked, fed down the pathway, plucked, fed down the pathway. And the third place that all the excess glucose is sent is to the fat cells. And on this high carbohydrate diet, Americans and Australians are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We looked at this process in another lecture, but I want to show you how it's influencing diabetes. You see, high glucose demands high insulin. But what's happening is, one of the first things that happens is that when you've got high glucose from a high carbohydrate diet coming into the cell gets to the point where it says, we've got enough. And so insulin resistance begins. And with insulin resistance, the cell is now resisting insulin because it's already got enough. And so the blood glucose levels stay high because the insulin can't get the glucose into the cell. And the brain says, blood glucose levels are still high, more insulin, more insulin. And the pancreas is releasing more and more and more. Can you see the problem? And what starts to happen now is the body says, I've got to do something. I've got to do something with all this glucose. So it spills it out into the urine. And diabetes mellitus means sweet urine. So one of the first signs of diabetes is this insulin resistance. And the poor old pancreas is getting screamed at, more insulin, more insulin. Well, it's not a happy chappy. I'll tell you a story that illustrates my son Peter. When he was, I think he was 14, he got a job at the local fruit and vegetable shop. In Australia, we've got little shops that just sell fruits and vegetables, and they're often owned by Italians. And we were about, 10-minute drive from the town, and Peter used to ride his bike every day. And he was so excited to have this little job in the afternoon. And there were two main women in the shop. There was Mama, the Italian Mama, and she was, late 60s. And then there was her daughter, who was probably mid-40s. And their Mama would say to Peter, Peter, take that broccoli out to the front. Peter would go out the front with the broccoli, big box. And the daughter would say, Peter, what are you doing with that broccoli? Now get it back into the storeroom. And if Peter said something, don't you answer me back. So Peter would turn around, and then he'd meet Big Mama. And Mum would say, Peter, what are you doing? I told you to put that broccoli, don't you answer me? Peter would go back, and then he'd meet the daughter, and blah, blah, blah. He's being tossed from pillar to post. Now we understand why most boys would last 1 week in that shop. Peter did well, he lasted 2. He'd come home with his backpack full of fruit and veggies they were going to throw out, and he'd say, Mum, you should see what I got today. And he'd tell me about the mama and the daughter. And you know, the best thing a mother can do is, you'll be right, mate. You'll be right. You know, the worst thing a mother can say is, oh, you poor boy, don't go to work anymore. No, it's a tough world out there. I said, you're good, mate. You're good, mate. You're getting some good veggies there and you're getting paid. After 2 weeks, he said, Mum, can I get another job? I said, yeah, we'll look for another job. What is the purpose of my illustration? And this is exactly what's happening with the pancreas. No, you're too high. No, you're too low. No, gap in. They were wearing their boys out because of these different messages. This is what's happening to the pancreas. More insulin, more insulin. No, stop the insulin, because when sugar goes in, blood glucose levels go very high. Because high glucose, nothing wrong with the sugar cane. It's the pure crystallized acid that's extracted from. It's like a truckload full of glucose all at once into the bloodstream. And it's a bit of a crisis, so the brain says, quick, insulin. High glucose demands high insulin. Up it goes. Brain says, oh no, too high, release the insulin. And because too much insulin was released, where's blood glucose levels going now? Actually too low. And now the brain says, oh no, too low, stop the insulin, release the glucagon. But what does the person usually do down there? It's called hypoglycemia. They reach for something that'll give them a quick high, which is a candy. Yeah, a cup of tea with 3 teaspoons of sugar, that'll get it up. Up it goes again. Oh no, stop the glucagon, release the insulin. Oh no, we're too good. See, it's like Peter in the fruit and veggie shop, isn't it? And pancreases wear out. And the pancreas gets to the point where it says, that's it. Just like Peter said, Mum, I'm done. I'm done. Not going to work anymore. It's just worn out. There's no doubt about it. Sugar does it. And this little section here, your high sugar ones, there's your croissants, there's your muffins, there's your cookies, there's, pasties, cakes, all those. It's all there, it's all there. But something else has come into the equation, and that is the wheat. The wheat was hybridised in the 1950s. They wanted to produce a plant with a high yield of grain to help with the starvation crisis, rushed through with no safety studies. And only now is it beginning to be revealed just the problems it's causing. What it did in the hybridisation of the wheat, it produced a starch structure called amylopectin. Amylopectin A. Amylopectin A, let's say this is average blood sugar. Amylopectin A gets blood sugar level up very high, very quick, and then you always get that corresponding low. That's the A. Let me give you something to compare it to, amylopectin B. Amylopectin B is found in bananas, potatoes. If you're familiar with the glycemic index of food, bananas and potatoes get it up reasonably high, reasonably fast. So this is your B. Reasonably high, not as low. There's your B. Amylopectin C is found in garbanzos, lentils, lima beans, black-eyed beans, cannellini beans, kidney beans, soy, all your beans. That gives a nice steady rise and a nice steady drop. What does every cell in our body want? The nice, steady, sure, consistent delivery of fuel. That gives a nice break to pancreases. No crises, oh no, too high, oh no, too low. This whiplash, all day long. That explains why the book by William Dufty is called Sugar Blues, because what does sugar cause? The blues. Well, something else is causing the blues, and that is this hybridised wheat. And how many of these foods here are out of the hybridised wheat? There's your cereal, your bread, your cakes, and we've got another 20 there, so we can have many ticks there, and your pizza and your pasta. So the majority of those high carbohydrate foods are made from the grain wheat. And in the 1950s, they started the intensive crossbreeding. 1976, Dr. Norman Bourlag got a Nobel Prize for his hybridised wheat. So then it went worldwide. So by the 1990s, every cereal, bread, cakes, and all etc., pasta, pizza, are all made out of this hybridised wheat. One lady said, what about organic wheat? I said, yep, it's the hybridised wheat. The only wheat that is not hybridised is Enkenhorn, Kamut, spelt. They're called ancient grains because they haven't been through the hybridisation process. So let me show you where wheat sits on the glycemic index. So with the glycemic index, what is the glycemic index? It's a reading on how quickly the glucose in that food is released into the blood. So baseline is 55. So underneath 55 is considered low GI or low glycemic index. So let me give you something to give you an idea. Cherries, in fact, all your berries, this can be blackberries, blueberries, all your cherries, they sit at about 26. Grapefruit. Grapefruit is not a very sweet fruit, but you will think it's sweet if you bite a seed. The seed is very bitter. It sits at 25. So they're great fruits for diabetics because they're low GI. Banana is quite high. Potato is high, whereas sweet potato, I think it sits at about 40. So what's the difference between a potato and a sweet potato? Well, with the naked eye, you can't see a difference. But under a microscope, it is revealed that the white potato has a very loose fibre structure, so the glucose is released quickly. Whereas with the sweet potato and the cherries, very tight fibre structure, so it slowly releases the glucose. And that can really only be seen with a microscope. But you can Google glycemic index and you can get you can get an idea of which foods are low and which foods are high. Sugar, whether it be white, tan or brown, sits at 59. And that's not a surprise. White, white wheat. So that's white bread, white pasta. That sits at 69. That's a surprise. And the reason is the amylopectin A. The amylopectin A that gets that blood sugar level up very high, very fast. Wholemeal or whole wheat. Whole wheat, it sits at 72. How could that be? Because the whole wheat is not refined, everything's there. There's more amylopectin A in it. Whereas the refined wheat has some of the amylopectin A taken out of it. My husband said, Barbara, what are you teaching? A lady just rang up and said, Barbara said white bread's better than brown bread. I said, Whole wheat, of course, is superior in that it has more fibre, it has more B vitamins, it's the whole wheat. The problem is the amylopectin A. Now, if someone doesn't have diabetes and doesn't have any health problems, to have a little wheat now and then, it won't be a big deal. But if someone has diabetes, this is something that must stop. Because when someone has diabetes, they need to give the pancreas an easy ride. They need to be taking foods that aren't going to get or demand dramatic releases of insulin and glucagon because it's already challenged. It's already not working well. And there are foods that are easy on the pancreas, and there are foods that are hard on the pancreas. Again, if someone doesn't have diabetes, they will hardly notice it. I have wheat, not much, but sometimes I have wheat and I notice no difference. That's because I don't have diabetes, my pancreas is working well, everything's working well. Why is everything working well? Well, I look after it. In fact, if I don't look after it, I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. This is often the missing link with diabetes. A lady said to me, I'm so frustrated. I do everything the nutritionist tells me. I was diagnosed with diabetes when I was 65. I'm now 69. She said, I eat whole grain cereal, whole wheat bread. I do all the whole wheats. And every 6 months I go to the doctor and he puts me on more insulin. She said, I'm so frustrated, I'm doing everything they tell me and I'm getting worse. And the lady down the road, she has sugar pops, she has soda pops, she has all the bad food. No wonder she's got diabetes, but I don't do that. She said, you have just solved the puzzle for me. It's the wheat. So why don't diabetics why aren't diabetics told this? Why doesn't the nutritionist tell them? Well, America grows a lot of wheat, is that right? Australia grows a lot of wheat. And the farmers love the wheat because they're getting 6 to 8 times more grain per acre with this hybridised wheat. That's 6 to 8 times more money. They've got to pay the bills. So for a farmer to say, well, I am not going to grow this wheat anymore. I'm going to go to the ancient grains. I'm going to go back to the spelt. See, when I was a little girl, the wheat grew that high. How high does it grow now? It grows that high. Well, it had to be short to hold the heavy grain. So if the farmer decides to do that, what's he now going to have to realise? He's going to take a huge drop in income. Can you see why so much has grown? So much has grown. I mean, Australia grows tons of it, you know. So then it's all stored in the silos, and then So you see, when you start touching the money, and we're not going to spend time going there, but that explains why. And when you realise that a lot of the textbooks in nutrition courses are funded by grain industries and wheat industries, they're going to say that. So you might say, well, where can I get this information? There's a book called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis. It's a bestseller. And I think it's a bestseller because this doctor, he tells the story. He gives the whole story of what happened to the wheat. He gives the story of Dr. Norman Bullag. Now remember, it was rushed through with no safety studies. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I want to know what's going into my body. And you see, another problem is not just the hybridised wheat, but this high carbohydrate diet. People say to me, Barbara, I hear of people who are carnivores and they're doing really well. Well, do you know when you stop that high carbohydrate diet and go over to a carnivore diet where you're having great amounts of proteins and fats, you know, the body can often say thanks. Because it was struggling under the high carbohydrate diet. But there's no need to go from that extreme to that extreme. We can get a balance. And the person might do quite well initially on the carnivore diet, but they're going to drastically be lacking fibre. So the colon's going to slow down. They're going to be drastically lacking the minerals and the vitamins that our fruits and vegetables give. We need a balance. And there's another big problem with meat today, and that is the way it's grown, the way it's killed, the way it's stored. 80% of the antibiotics made are given to the animals. I was in Ireland a couple of years ago. I was being driven around by this guy. He was in his late 70s, he'd be in his 80s now. He said, I used to be a dairy farmer. He said, this was in the 60s. He said, I can't believe how many antibiotics we used to give the cows. I said, why? He said, well, the udders were so heavy that the hooves would split. And when the hooves split, they'd get infected. So we just pump them full of antibiotics. Yee. That was in the 60s. Have things improved? I think not. Maybe it's just a little bit not as well known, but I was surprised when he was telling me about his experience, and I'll never forget his words. He said, I can't believe how many antibiotics we used to give the animals. It is true that if you grow your own and you kill it humanely and properly and it's stored quickly, obviously there's going to be a big difference. But I don't know about you, but I'm happy with lentils for my protein. So let's have a look at how you can apply the sustain me principles to diabetes. Sunshine. Sunshine gets those nutrients, those minerals into the cell. Your pancreas requires vitamin D, for the cells to be able to function effectively and make the hormones. Use of water. Many people don't realise that water between meals maintains blood glucose levels. Many people don't realise that the hunger pang between the meal is actually not for food, it's for water. And as we saw last night, the stomach is not happy when you interfere digestion, when you put something in halfway through the meal. It's water and water alone that will do it. A lady came to me and she said, my little daughter, she's only 9 years old, she's diabetic, and we're giving her snacks because her blood sugar levels drop. And the other children want the snacks, and we've never given our children snacks between meals. I said, try a little salt with the water between the meals. I saw her the next day and she said, it's doing it. That little bit of salt, those minerals and that water between meals helps to maintain blood glucose levels. And as we saw last night, it takes 3.5 to 4 hours to digest the meal. So the food's actually still in the stomach. And remember where all the nutrients are absorbed? Even when the stomach's empty, the nutrients are being absorbed in the small intestine. Stomachs work well when they get a rest, and they need a rest between meals. So let's come down to moderation. The research is showing today that time-restricted eating is helping diabetics much more than eating every 2 hours. Do you remember when they said diabetics had to eat every 2 hours? Have you noticed today they're pushing the time-restricted eating? If they're not, they're back with the dinosaurs. What's time-restricted eating? That's eating twice in a 24-hour period, 6 hours apart. That brings us to nutrition. So we should be having high fibre. What fibre does is slowly releases the glucose. That gives that nice, steady, sure delivery of fuel. We need generous proteins. And your best proteins, the cleanest burning fuel, is your plant proteins. There's your legumes, nuts, and seeds. Because plant protein, the food that's the highest in plant protein, is your legumes, nuts, and seeds. Grains also have protein, but they're also high in carbohydrates. Whereas legumes are medium to low in carbohydrates, and your nuts and seeds are low carbohydrate. And healthy fats. What are the healthy fats? The healthy fats are the fats that come from the hand of the Creator. There's your nuts, your seeds, your avocados, coconuts. And the two fats that have been used for centuries and extracted in women's kitchens because they're extracted from the flesh of the plant is your coconut and your olive oil. Personally, I like the taste of olive oil better than the taste of coconut oil. But I certainly don't mind coconut oil in some of those beautiful frozen plant-based desserts. It's up to you. We had a Fijian cook, and he certainly loved to use the coconut oil. And as we saw in our last lecture, it's not fat that causes heart disease. And as you can see by this, it's not fat that makes you fat. What is it? It's the high carbohydrate. That's a dangerous fat. Too many carbs, can't use it all, so it gets dumped here. First of all, it goes on the inactive parts of the body, the arms, the thighs, the hips, stomach, and then it'll start going inside and weigh down your internal organs. The book Wheat Belly, the reason why it's called Wheat Belly, he shows that this hybridized wheat gets the blood sugar level up so high, so fast, the body has to grab that and store it as a visceral fat. And whereas it stores it quickest is on the belly. In fact, nearly every page he uses the term wheat belly. I'm sure we're all familiar with that famous movie called Sound of Music. It's the first time I ever went to the cinema. Dad took us all right into Sydney to see Sound of Music. Have you seen the size of Julie Andrews' waist? Remember when waists were tiny? There's a lot of reasons why not now. One can be a hormonal imbalance, as we saw this morning. This afternoon, yes, morning. It was as we saw this morning. But it also can be this high wheat diet. People are overdoing the wheat, and yet there are so many different grains that we could be eating. Sleep. Tomorrow night we will look at the importance of sleep. It's particularly in the early hours of the night that regeneration in the body happens. So ideally we're in bed by 9, at the very latest 10 summertime. It's those early hours of the night that hormones are released that are responsible for regeneration and rejuvenation. And we're looking particularly in the pancreas. Trust in God. This method of natural healing requires faith. Psalm 146, we looked at it, verse 3. Put not your trust in princes, neither in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. His breath goes forth, he returns unto his earth in that very day. His thoughts perish. Happy is he that hath the God of Jacob as his help, which made heaven, earth, sea, and all that therein is, which keepeth truth forever. And the Bible has a description of faith. It's found in Hebrews 11 verse 1. It says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If you can see it, it's not faith. My body's not healed yet. My pancreas isn't healed yet, but I believe it will. In the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, by the neurologist Dr. Norman Doidge, he says an important part of healing is picturing the pancreas healing. And he gives the story of a man who had a stroke. And they wired him up with electrodes. And then they said to him, now move your arm. And he said, I cannot move my arm. And the electrodes showed that as soon as he said that, the nerves to the arm ceased. Because he said, I cannot move my arm. So they said to him, we want you to say, I'm going to try and move my arm. Eventually, this arm's going to move. And the nerves started again. So our mind has an effect on our body. Every cell in the body is very obedient to the mind. That's why I saw a lady last week. She said, I can't sleep, I can never sleep. I said, the first step is never to say that again. I'm going to try. I'm going to try. So that's what faith is. If you can see it, is not faith. And faith and hope are inseparable companions. And hope sees the invisible, feels the intangible, and achieves the impossible. Isn't that a beautiful saying? My daughter found that. And faith and hope are inseparable companions. Natural healing is based on faith. Faith in a body and its ability to heal itself. I'm going to get there. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. I'm working towards that. That's faith. Abstain. There are some things that must cease if you want to conquer diabetes. What do we abstain from? Caffeine. Why caffeine? When caffeine is taken into the body, it causes a crisis response. And when a crisis response happens, the body releases more insulin to get more glucose into the cell because you're about to do the run or the climb or the fight of your life. Everyone that's been in a war zone knows that feeling. And the person sitting in a coffee shop saying, oh, this feels good. One lady said, I love my coffee, it just gets me going in the morning. I said, yeah, you've just triggered a crisis response. And what eventually happens when you're in a crisis 3 times a day? You get depleted. Yeah, to take caffeine for an energy is like taking out a loan to pay off your loan. What's eventually going to happen? There's nothing left. And it's called adrenal exhaustion. You've been living on your bank account for too long and there's nothing much left. What also must stop is sugars. If someone has diabetes, they have a compromised pancreas. And absolutely refined sugar must totally cease. But even maple syrup and honey, you have to be cautious of that until the pancreas becomes happy, and it will. And it will. But until then, the sugars must be greatly reduced. There's one sugar that won't get an insulin response, and that's stevia. It's a plant sweetener. One lady said, oh, I don't like stevia. I said, you've used too much. Because if you use too much, it gets a bitter aftertaste. And it's hard to believe that 1/16 of a teaspoon is equal to 2 teaspoons of sugar. That's hard to believe, isn't it? So most people use too much. Just use the lightest sprinkle. And if it's not sweet enough, another tiny sprinkle. but start slowly. If it gets to the bitter, you've just overdone it. What also must cease to conquer diabetes is wheat. And you can see why this is so. Because of the blood sugar level rise that wheat causes, which is a surprise to most people. And that's why I'm very thankful for independent writers like Dr. William Davis, who's got decades of clinical practice up his sleeve and saw it with his own eyes and searched out the research, and there it all is. You can see for yourself. I was in Bermuda giving meetings a few years ago, and a doctor emailed me. He'd been coming to the lectures. He said, "You're wrong on the wheat." He said, "I eat wheat and I don't have diabetes." And I wrote back and said, "Yeah, but look at you. You exercise every day. You're fit, you're strong. And I'd like to suggest you're not eating it 3 times a day." Actually, how many people are eating it 6 times a day? Cereal and toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, pasta for tea, cakes, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, cookies, donuts. What's that? That's 100% wheat. You know, in the Garden of Eden, when God's talking to Adam and Eve, he says, "Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed." What's a herb-bearing seed? That's a grain, that's a legume, that's also seed, and also the nuts. God didn't say, "Behold, I've given you wheat." Isn't that what many, they just overdo one. But it's not just overdoing one, they're actually overdoing the hybridized one. And the reason they hybridize that is because I guess that's the most popular. And that's why it's used in such great amounts. Abstain from alcohol. It's a high sugar. It's got to stop. So there are some things that must stop if you're looking for optimum performance. Inhale. Inhale through the nostrils, through the nose, in and out, to raise your oxygen levels, to ensure that you're getting 18 times more energy from your cells. And that cell, and that energy cycle in the cell is in every pancreatic cell. Moderation, doing the time-restricted eating. Don't overload the stomach, or you will inhibit your body's ability to access the nutrients. Exercise. This morning we looked at time-restricted eating, and we also looked at the importance of that with diabetes. And we also looked at exercise, the high-intensity interval training. And the high-intensity interval training, doing those bouts of high intensity, reverses insulin resistance. You can reverse insulin resistance in a matter of days. Isn't that good news? By getting that high carbohydrate diet down, getting it low. Carbohydrates are not bad. My husband would never forgive me if the potatoes stopped. No, carbohydrates aren't bad. It's only when they're overdone and refined, and isn't that what many are doing? Get the carbohydrate levels down. Become well hydrated, at least 8 ounces a day. Take that salt with every glass to help maintain those blood glucose levels. And something else happens. When we do the high intensity interval training, and that high intensity, it's almost as if the body goes into a little bit of a shock. Wow, we're moving. We've got to start adapting to this movement. So what it does is it develops extra receptor sites for insulin. Because that cell saying, we need more, we need more. This body is moving, we need more. Let me tell you about Dan. Dan was only 19 when he came to our retreat, carrying a little bit excess weight. He was on 90 units of insulin a day. Often when people are on a high insulin, they're carrying excess weight because insulin has a one set mind. I must store, I must store. That's what it does. He was on 90 units of insulin a day, and as I consulted with him, he told me his story because I want to know why. Why has this 19-year-old got diabetes? He said, well, when I was 15, I had a really bad chest cold. He said, yeah, I know I should have rested, but I kept going, as young people do. So it got worse and worse, and he got wet one day and chilled even more. So the doctor put him on a very strong course of 2 antibiotics at once. And he said it killed the beta cells in his pancreas. So after that course of antibiotics, he now had type 1 diabetes. He said, my doctor told me that my pancreas was dead. I said, is it gangrene? What's dead? If there's blood going through that pancreas, it's alive because the life of the flesh is the blood. Amen. In Australia, we have cattle farms, hundreds of thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of sheep on these big cattle and sheep stations way out west. You probably know in the middle of Australia it's a bit deserty. And they can't keep their eye on every sheep. And the sheep have big tails. And if they have a lot of rain, and of course the sheep do their droppings, and then some of the droppings stick underneath there, then the blowflies come in, and that's called fly blown. And if a sheep gets fly blown under their tail, they have to be killed, of course. So what they do is they cut the tail. Because when you're trying to keep an eye on hundreds of thousands of sheep, it's just much easier to cut their tail. So when the little lamb is born, within a few weeks, they put a rubber ring around the neck or the base of the tail. And within, I think it's about a week, I'm not sure exactly how long, the tail just falls off. Why does it fall off? Why does it die? What have they stopped? Blood. That's right. The blood is the life. You stop the blood, you stop the life. So if there's blood going into that pancreas, it's alive. Dan was with us for 4 weeks. He's a very quiet young man, and he told me this later, that he'd get a blood sugar level low in the middle of the night, he'd take a candy, and that would get his blood sugar level up, but it always gave him a headache, because it was just too high. Why was he getting a blood sugar level low? Because he wasn't eating this anymore. And the first 2 days are juicing days, and they're mostly carrot, celery and apple juices. They're not high sugar juices. Second week, he felt a bit guilty, so he decided not to do the candy. If he had a blood sugar level low in the middle of the night, he'd eat an apple. It takes a long time to eat an apple in the middle of the night. It would get the blood sugar level up, but he wouldn't get the headache. Third week, he did something else. He'd been listening to the lectures. If he got a blood sugar level low in the middle of the night, he'd get up, jump on the floor, do 30 push-ups. What's he releasing? He's releasing his glycogen stores. And if they run out, the fat stores. And that would get his blood sugar level up. In fact, he told me that one morning, now our levels are different to your levels, the readings. So I have to tell you our readings because that's what I'm familiar with. I'm sure my blood sugar levels would sit between probably 5.5, 6.5. So that's normal. A diabetic, they can sometimes go up to 13, 14, 15, 16. That's just too high. He woke up one morning, took his blood glucose, and it was 3. That's too low. That's almost passing out. He took the salt, took the water, got dressed, had another salt and water. So I think he had 2.5 glasses of water, put his joggers on and went for a run, high intensity, up and down the hills. He went for about 20 minutes, came back, took his blood glucose levels, 9. He'd had nothing to eat. 9. Where'd that come from? His glycogen stores and fat stores. As his body needed it, it's an incredible process that starts to release the glycogen stores, feed it down the pathway, and if necessary, it goes to the fat stores. In fact, he said to me by the 3rd week, he said, why didn't anyone tell me about my glycogen stores? Already sitting in the muscle cell. By the 3rd week, he'd gone from 90 units of insulin down to 10 units of insulin a day, type 1 diabetic. Is his pancreas dead? Not at all. As his blood glucose levels balanced, he eased off. We see blood glucose levels changing quite quickly with the change, basically, not only in the diet, but in the sustain me principles. He went home a very happy young man. He's only 19. What's the future? What's the future if his old life continues? It's not good. One young man, we had the same results. And when he went home, I was talking to his grandmother. She said, Mark visited me. Mark sat down and Mark talked to me. She said, you don't realise how big that is. Because when the blood glucose levels drop down, which is quite common with this, when pancreas isn't working well and too much insulin, then it's down there. What's the brain like? What are the emotions like? When blood glucose levels drop down, you see our brain only has a 2-minute supply of glucose. Once the blood glucose levels drop, how long have you got before brain's not working well? The person gets impatient, the person gets annoyed. So when this lady said, he's talking to me, he's sitting and talking to me, because his blood glucose levels are balanced, which means his brain is now balanced, his emotions are now balanced. But I think one of the most remarkable stories comes from a man, we'll call him Tom, and he came to our retreat in Alabama, about 6 years ago now, and he was 62. And when he arrived, he was in a wheelchair. He'd flown in from Florida. You see, he said to me, I've spent $1 million on my health in the last 10 years. He said, I have the top specialists. He was a wealthy man. I have the top specialists. He said, recently they've told me they can do no more for me. They took my lymph nodes out of my groin to try and work out why I had diabetes. I can't get my mind around that one. So when he flew, because he's got no lymph nodes there, or very little, his legs swelled. That's why I was in a wheelchair. He said, I'm not usually in a wheelchair. He just spent $800 on these fancy bandages for his legs. I said, you won't need those. Keep them in their packet, you maybe get your money back. But from looking at his finances, I don't think that was a bother to him. But notice this man, wealthy man, spent $1 million, has the best specialists, and they've just told him they can do no more for him. He was on 90 units of insulin a day, short and long acting. He was on medication for blood pressure, medication for blood cholesterol, medication for blood thinning. He said, I will not be able to do the morning walk. I said, that's right. But I said, what I want you to do is I want you to get on the little mini trampoline, the rebounder, 1 minute every hour. So just get on and just do this. That's all he could do, was just the tiny little jump. Not jumping, just... See, what the rebounder does is it moves your lymphatic system. And on Friday, when we look at activity is life, I'll be explaining in detail the lymphatic system. Within 48 hours, he had to reduce his insulin. His legs were going down. He couldn't believe it. He started to walk with the other guests. I said, I think it's best that you don't go as far as the other guests, but just listen to the legs. See, this is a very important part of healing, is listening. And your body can tell you what no man can tell you. Just listen. That's why we don't take blood sugar levels. We leave it to the person, because soon they're going to go home, and guess what? They're there. We just teach. We say, try this. What does your body say? Try this. What does your body say? He emailed me. By the way, when he went home after 2 weeks, he's on 10 units of insulin a day from 90. Type 1 diabetic. Both these stories are type 1 diabetics. Type 2 is easier. I'm telling you the hardest cases. He emailed me 3 months later. He said, I am off all my medication. type 1 diabetic, off his insulin, totally off his insulin, off everything. When he was with us, he stopped the blood thinning meds and he stopped the statin meds, but he stayed on his blood pressure a little bit longer. When he came home, he was 62, his wife, who's 42, said, "This is your baby. I like my croissants and my champagne, thank you very much." So he just continued to do what he had learned. He said to me, "Anything you tell me to do, I will do," and he's right. He did it. So when he emailed me back at 3 months, he said, "My doctors are astonished." I think it is our duty to astonish our doctors, is that right? Our specialists. He said, "My doctors are astonished." Do you remember what they'd done? They sent him home basically to die. He basically told the few companies he'd been a CEO of, I'm going to have to retire. Well, guess what? He went back into the office and said, "I'm back." He said, "I have lost," now in 3 months, he lost 45 kilos. That's what, about 90 pounds. I said, "Tell me about your exercise program, Tom." He said, "I swim 30 laps of the pool a day." He said, I bicycle 6 miles a day." He said, "I rebound 3 times a day." What are you prepared to put into this? He was prepared, and he got the results. People say to me, "You've got some amazing stories, Barbara. Do you have any failures?" The only failure is the part of the person to do what you've got to do to get the results. When people say, "How long will this take?" I say, "How long's a piece of string?" That's a saying we have in Australia. It can be 1 inch and it can be 10 metres long, 10 yards long. It all depends. It depends on the person, the age, previous damage, how chronic the situation is, how willing they are to do what you've got to do. And this man was willing. $1 million in the last 10 years, where he could have come to the retreat twice a year for 10 years. Do you know what's interesting? After 6 months, he emailed me again. He said, "My wife's interested." And you know what? His work colleagues, they were a little bit, "Oh no, he's back." They're not like that now. He's a different man. Because the way he was eating and his up and down blood sugar levels, he was a bit of a tyrant. His wife's interested. They actually remarried. She said, "I'm marrying a different man." She said, "This is the man I fell in love with that I lost for a few years." He said, "She's interested now. She stopped her croissants." She said she's found a little shop that does some gluten-free croissants with some healthy stuff that she treats herself with every now and then. He said that when we got married, we had alcohol-free wine at our wedding. And he went to the health retreat and got the plant-based cook to come, and he said, I've got a barbecue out there because some of these guys, they've got to have their steak. So he said, I've got a few of those things, but he said the most attractive and the most beautiful food we served was all plant-based food. And he said, and some beautiful desserts. You know, desserts aren't bad. I love desserts. I have it maybe once a week. You can get some beautiful desserts. They needn't be bad. How many people think when you have a treat, you've got to have a little bit of naughty stuff? No. No, you can get some beautiful, beautiful foods. Food should not only be good for you, but it should taste fantastic. And how often food doesn't taste fantastic because people think the fat and the salt is bad. But you can use good quality olive oils, you can use good quality salt, and doesn't that make food taste good? And I use a lot of herbs. When I'm in the Netherlands, I do the cooking at this place I stay at, and in 1 week I use their 6 months supply of herbs. Makes the food taste delicious. In Australia we have Italian herbs, it's a nice mix, and I know in Holland they call it, and in Germany they call it French herbs. It's got marjoram and thyme and basil and oregano, nice little mix. So it's a lovely story about Tom, and it's a lovely story about his witness was his life. It wasn't actually what he said, it's what he did. And in Exodus, it's chapter 15, verse 26, Moses is telling the Israelites, if you will diligently hearken, listen, to the voice of the Lord your God in your body. You've got to listen. If it likes it, do it. If it doesn't like it, keep adjusting till it works. If you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God and do that which is right in his sight, in our sight. Give ear to his commandments, keep all his statutes. What are commandments and statutes? They're laws. Here are the laws of health. Do it. Implement it. And you will see the results. And the slight adjustments are yours. Work out what exercise works for you. Work out how the time restricted eating works for you. If someone's going to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and has to eat at 6, they're going to probably have to eat again at midday, and they're probably going to have to eat again at 6 o'clock at night, but just make it light. So there's no absolute. If there's anything that I've learned in my years of teaching, it's not to be absolute. It's, we'll see what works. A little bit of an adjustment here and there. You've got to do what works for you, because there's no one like you. That's why you should be your doctor. Only you know how you feel, only you know how your body works, only you know how different things respond or react in your body. So it was about 3 weeks ago, I ran a program at Evening Shade, Arkansas. And there was a lady there who was in her mid-50s, and she was on 90 units of insulin a day, eating the high carbohydrate diet. She'd been told to eat a lot of carbs. How many diabetics are told that? I just got a message yesterday, and the doctor has a pump on her, and he's halved her dose. He said, if this continues, we're going to take your pump out in a few weeks. Type 1 diabetic. Isn't that incredible? And you know what the doctor said? Tell me what you're doing. Isn't that nice? Are there any questions as we close? I can repeat the questions. Yeah.
Focus, and in that protocol there is no use of oil. What is your thought on that?
Yes, you may have heard that. There are some that are claiming that it's the oil that's contributing to the diabetes. Well, the stories that I have given you, and I've given you 2 of many. Actually, I've given you 3, haven't I? There's the lady from a few weeks ago. And what they are using is they're using olive oil. Olive oil has been used for centuries. In fact, if you look at the Bible talks extensively about olive oil. And there's the story of the lady. She was a widow, and she fed Elijah the prophet for 3 years through a time of drought. And she said, but this is my last meal and my last oil. And the prophet said, God has said that the oil will not lack, nor the meal fail in the time of no rain. And every morning when she went to her barrel, there was a little more flour. And when she went to her cruse, there was a little bit more oil. That must have been a nice meal, hey? And nice oil. Who put the oil in that cruse? God did. What has God just said about olive oil? It's good. It is good. And the Mediterraneans, they've been using olive oil for centuries. There is an oil that will interfere with the uptake of insulin. And I'm sure you're not surprised to know it is these highly refined oils. And it was when these highly refined oils came on the scene, that's when heart disease went through the roof, and it certainly is a contributing factor to the diabetes. And so keep right away from those refined oils. The ones that are in the clear plastic bottles in the supermarket, you know, straight away, to keep away from those. Go to the extra virgin, first cold pressed olive oil, which will be in a dark bottle. Yeah?
Saying that, doesn't the use of plastics with those refined oils, doesn't the plastic itself leach into the oil? I've read about that on several occasions. The plastic, it interacts with the highly refined oils.
Yes.
And it would actually, the oil causes the plastic to leach, because plastic's made from oil, and it leaches into the oil, so we're actually drinking the plastic with the olive oil.
Nasty stuff, really nasty stuff. And it's interesting to note that it was that when those oils came on the scene, that's when the heart disease. So you've not only got damage to the arterial walls from those oils certainly can interfere with the uptake of insulin. So that, you know, there's oils and there's oils. And what's today? Tuesday. I think it's on Thursday. We'll be looking in detail at the structure of oils and how they work with the body.
You said cold pressed?
First cold pressed extra virgin olive oil is the best oil to use. Yeah.
You mentioned a few different wheats that were acceptable, einkorn, and what were the others?
So these wheats are acceptable because they haven't been hybridized.
Okay.
Enkenhorn, or sometimes called Enkhorn, also Kamut,
Okay.
C-A-M-U-T, and Spelt. Spelt is probably the most common.
Okay. I've been buying wheat, what are they calling it? They're calling it heritage wheat,
Yeah.
organic. And they're saying it's not hybridized.
Okay.
Do you
that's
feel
great.
like that's,
Well, if they say it's not hybridized, hopefully it isn't.
yeah, hopefully not.
But the original wheat that God made was the Enkenhorn. And then the Enkhorn did a wild hybrid with a field grass, they estimate a few thousand years ago, and that produced the Emmer strain of wheat. So that's another one, E-M-M-E-R. And it was the Emmer strain of wheat that was put through intensive crossbreeding. And that produced the hybridized wheat. So you can get what's called ancient grains or the original grains. You can still get them.
How about purple potatoes? Like they're white, but they're purple colored potatoes, the skin and the potato itself is purple?
Yeah, they're good, they're good.
Okay.
It's like potatoes aren't bad, you just don't eat a whole plate full of them.
Oh, yes, I do.
Well, if you don't have diabetes, you can.
Yeah, I was just wondering, my sister just got diagnosed with a cyst on her pancreas, the head of it on her pancreas. Would, I forgot, the castor oil help her, the castor oil?
Yeah, the castor oil can help break up cysts, that's right.
That would help. Another question was the insulin resistance. Just cutting down on sugars, will that be enough, or would you also do this, all those things that you mentioned with the sunshine and the water and the sleep and all that?
All of these need to be, it's like every piece of jigsaw must be in place to get the results.
And that's one of the worst things that would happen with the insulin. I mean, it will get better. The insulin resistance can be reversed.
Oh, it can be reversed because what we've got to do, we've got to turn this pancreas round to a happy pancreas. We've got to stop beating it up.
Okay, thank you.
I want to hand it right to Maggie.
Hi. Back to the whole milk. So I know like several farmers are good friends of mine, and they said that they dump the milk that they use. Like if a cow gets an antibiotic, they dump it. So would that be okay?
Well, that's good. I'm glad that they do. But the farmer I talked to, all his cows had it. And I also know that where my daughter lives in Wisconsin, across the road was a dairy farm. It eventually got closed down. but it ran for years and years. And you know, the things they put on the udder to get the milk, it'd fall into the manure and they just pick it up and put it on the next udder. Ugh.
Right.
It was a really filthy dairy. We just couldn't believe that they hadn't been closed down. They were eventually closed down because they found E. coli in the milk. But the farmer down the road, it was pristine clean. But the milk truck picks up that milk and then mixes it with this milk.
But if you can get it right from the farm, and you know they're clean, and you know that they're separating the
Well,
milk, would that be?
I have friends in Australia that have an organic dairy farm and they have an organic chook farm too. And they said it's like we've got contraband. People secretly come because it's against the law.
Yes.
But yeah, obviously that will be a far superior,
Okay.
far superior milk, yeah.
I actually have a friend, I don't know the depth of it, but he has pancreas infection. He's in the hospital for 100 days. He's muscle tone, doesn't walk or anything like that. And it's an infection of the pancreas, and the doctors are befuddled. I have no real contact with him other than passing by. I don't know, but what can be done for an infection?
Yeah, that's a real hard one once they're in hospital, and I'm sure they've got him on IV antibiotics, so that it's got to get home as soon as possible and start putting the castoral compress on the pancreas that's under the left rib. And also, as you can see, this diet, it's kind to the pancreas. So it's doing things that are going to be easy on the pancreas.
You might not want to hear this, but I can definitely confirm what you said about the cow's milk. That was my first job as a young teenager, actually even earlier than that. And I worked right up until I was about 17 years of age. And I used to see the milk truck come, and I had to be there when he took these little like scoops, stainless steel scoops out, and I said, "What's that?" And he goes, "Well, I have to test for fecal content." And I looked at him like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "There's just a limited amount of fecal content in the milk that's acceptable." I said, "No way." And he said, "Well, look when he draws out the last of the milk." And sure enough, there was about a half a cup of cow manure in that milk. And I used to take the cream off the top, which the farmer used to yell at me for doing, but it was the most delicious. But after that, never again.
Yeah, that's right. There's, as far as the east is from the west is organic, clean dairy compared to many. But then again, myself, I've never been able to handle the dairy. It's obviously not in my genes. So there are many factors that come into play with dairy.
I just want to say one thing real quick. I used to help the farmer inoculate the cows, and never once did we pour the milk out. It went right into the tank. So so this is, and I don't know of any other farmer that did
Only if the mastitis is really high, and they might not milk that one.
You see, what happens is those things that go onto milk, you can have big mama cow with a big udder, and then you can have teenage cow that's not as big, but those machines are still drawing that milk out, but there's no more milk. And then it can get irritated inside the udder, and the next day there can be pus there. And that's what I understand too, that there's also allowed to be a certain amount of pus in the milk because it's almost impossible. Yeah. I like lentils myself.
How about goat's milk? Or
Yeah, goat's milk certainly is closer to human milk than than cow's milk, but I don't know, but I've had some goat's cheese and I just think it tastes like goat.
What about oat milk or pistachio milk? As long you can get some plant milks. Personally, I don't use any. When my grandchildren come and they like a porridge for breakfast, because we don't usually do a porridge for breakfast, I have some organic soy milk for them, but if they don't come for 6 months, we don't even open a milk for 6 months because we just don't use it. So again, it's what you usually do. What you can do, what works. Thank God for plants. Yeah? What do you typically eat for breakfast in your second?
What do I typically eat for breakfast? Well, my husband decided to go on the cheap when he was 30 to get his molars out, and the students did it under general anaesthetic, and they wired his mouth open and broke his jaw. Anyway, and his face swelled up like this. So he had to go on some very strong antibiotics to get that infection down, which probably saved his life. But when I married him when he was 40, so this is 10 years later, he had major yeast problems. I'd wake at night with him scratching. So after those antibiotics, he had this yeast presence. And he was a high carbohydrate consumer. He was a single father with 2 kids, and my husband's he's very good at cooking toast. That's about it. So the high carbohydrate diet was just feeding this yeast thing. So after we'd been married about a year, I said, I want to knock this. Anyway, he let me do whatever I want. So I put him on no sugar. I put him actually on the cancer-conquering diet, even though he didn't have cancer. I just wanted to knock it hard. For 6 weeks, he had no fruit at all. And he said at first he thought his throat was cut. But what I did for breakfast every day, I'd do a skillet of vegetables. It was broccoli, cauliflower, carrot, and onion. I did that every morning. And then I'd make lentils, or brown lentils, or red lentils, or black-eyed beans, because they're quick, and sourdough toast with avocado. And he learnt to love that. He loved it very much. And of course the main meal was easy because it's just all veggies. And if he did want something at night, because we had an early lunch, he would just have maybe some crackers with avocado and tomato. And after 6 weeks, he said to me, do I have to go back on fruit? And it is now 10 years later, and every morning I make him a skillet of vegetables. Now, I like fruit for breakfast. So I do his veggies. Takes me about 3 minutes to put it all together, put it on the heat and turn it very low. And I have fruit. I love cherries, I love grapefruit, just depends what's in season, what I eat. And then we both have sourdough. We can get the sourdough Emma bread at a bakery in our town. And then we have avocado, and some days we have red lentils on toast, on avocados. Sometimes we have brown lentils, sometimes we have black-eyed beans. So that's our breakfast, and a few nuts and seeds. And everyone that comes to our house has the same breakfast, and they love it. And when our grandchildren come, I cook them a porridge, so they'll have a millet porridge usually with a bit of honey and soy milk, chopped banana on top. And then they always want the toast with the avocado and the lentils on top. And I do not hear from those children for 6 hours. In fact, sometimes I have to coo-ee them and find out, that's the Australian call. You've heard of the Australian call? Coo-ee! That's the Australian call. All the grandchildren and the children know the Australian call. So that's what we have for breakfast.
What did you say was in the veggie thing? You said broccoli, carrots, onion. That's it. Cauliflower. Oh, cauliflower.
Yeah, that's what he has every morning. And guess what? After being on that for 6 weeks, no more scratching. all these issues that he'd been struggling with for 10 years. He just thought, that's what I have to live with.
So no eggs ever?
No, no. If you like eggs, eat eggs, but I myself prefer lentils.
So are you saying that the skin is itchy because of yeast?
Yeah. It was between the toes, and also it was anal itch around that area. I just wake up with scratch. And that's why I thought, we're going to knock this. And I knew it was a yeast thing in his body. So what we did, and my book explains that you've got to starve the yeast, which means we got the sugars right down. You know, sometimes if he has 2 bunches of grapes, sometimes his toes itch a little bit. And sometimes if we have a Chinese meal, he'll get a little bit of itch in his toes. So we manage it. And if you can manage it, you're doing very well.
Do you still have those retreats in Alabama?
Yeah, unfortunately, Alabama, Living Springs doesn't have a health director anymore. So
Okay.
I am going there in a few weeks, but it's full with 120 on the waiting list. But there is another retreat I go to occasionally, and that's Eden Valley in Loveland, Alabama. End of day, the words are getting mixed up. It's in Colorado, Denver, Colorado. And
Okay.
they run very similar to our program, and they're quite busy.
Okay, the most important question of the whole night, when's breakfast?
After your high-intensity interval training in the morning. I'd like to say close with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for what you've taught us today, and thank you that it is so simple, and thank you for this incredible body that when it's given the right conditions, it can respond, it can revive, and it can even heal. Thank you, Father, and may you bless each one of us with a great night's sleep, and we'll meet again tomorrow. In Jesus' name I pray this, amen.